Welcome to Curiously Kaitlyn, where we try to make theology make sense. Many of you know that Curiously Kaitlyn is part of the Holy Post network, but did you know it's also a part of Holy Post Plus? What's Holy Post Plus? It's your place for exclusive Holy Post content like bonus interviews, a quarterly book club, Sky's podcast, The Sky Pod, and my other podcast, Getting Schooled by Kaitlyn Chess, where I teach Sky about theology, church history, politics, and even Taylor Swift. Think of it like the slightly advanced course of Curiously Kaitlyn. And we are currently working on some Curiously Kaitlyn exclusives that will be on Holy Post Plus in the coming weeks that I think you're really going to like. So head on over to holypost.com/Patreon and sign up today for just $5 a month.
I don't know. That doesn't make any sense.
Dr. Carmen Imes, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, Kaitlyn. So good to be with you.
This is Dr. Carmen Imes. She is Associate Professor of Old Testament at Biola University and the author of Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters, and Being God's Image, Why Creation Still Matters. She's also played a big role in welcoming and mentoring women biblical scholars and theologians, which makes her an even bigger deal in my book. All right, let's hear our kid question today.
My question is why God chose the Israelites as his special people out of everyone else and blessed them in a certain way he didn't bless others.
A very good question. And you can kind of hear some angst in the question, which I really like. So, Dr. Imes, what is your initial reaction to this question? Why did God choose Israel and bless them in ways that he didn't bless other people?
I have heard this question so many times from grown-ups.
Yeah.
So this is a question that a lot of people wrestle with because it doesn't feel fair. Yeah. It doesn't feel fair for God to play favorites, to pick some people to bless and everybody else is just on their own. And that feels wrong to us, and it should feel wrong to us. And so we wonder, what kind of a God would do that?
Yeah.
And what does it say about him? And where do we fit into this story? So I really appreciate the question.
Yeah. I love that almost every question we've had, the scholars have been like, this is a good question. This is a very reasonable question for someone to ask. So let's start with just the first part. Because I think there's both the angst you were just describing of this doesn't feel fair. So we can talk about the character of God part of that in a minute. But first, let's just start with, in the story of Scripture, is there an answer to just, within this story, why choose a specific people? And so why choose a specific people, first of all, and then why this people? Did they do something to deserve it?
Yeah. So it's such a good question to start with because I think our way of processing the whole Old Testament story hangs in the balance of how we answer this question. So when we start to read Genesis, we find out that God makes all humans and he gives us a job to rule the earth on his behalf. We're his image. It's all exciting. There's beautiful, good garden. And then things go wrong and people start sinning and things spiral downward. And the downward spiral gets worse and worse. People start killing each other and, all sorts of things happen. The flood.
Remember our last episode with Dr. Matthew Lynch? You can go back there to hear more about how sin destroyed creation, how God responded with the flood, and God's promise to not destroy creation again. Dr. Lynch described how after the flood, there was a renewed promise to creation, but sin still affects it.
And in Genesis 12, there's a kind of pivot to the story where God chooses one man, Abram, to bless and to focus on. And if we at that point conclude that God is doing this because, he's just given up on everybody else, then the rest of the Bible is going to feel wrong to us. We're always going to have that nagging question. So I think the best place to go for us to think about how to answer this question is Genesis chapter 12. And just see exactly what does God say to Abram.
Yeah.
Because the question was asking about the Israelites, but the Israelites are the great-great-grandchildren of Abram. And so it's what God says to Abraham that makes the difference. So I'm just going to read from Genesis chapter 12.
Yeah.
The first 3 verses. So the Lord had said to Abram, we later call him Abraham. God later changes his name to Abraham, but here it's just still Abram.
We could say a lot more about this change from Abram to Abraham, but in general, it's a big deal in the Bible when someone's name changes, especially when it's God who changes it. Names are really important. They define us, identify us to other people. So when a name changes, it's like a sign telling us, pay attention to what's going on here. To read more about what's going on when Abraham's name changes, you can read Genesis chapter 17.
So the Lord had said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And then here's the really important part for our question. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So when God chooses Abram, he's not deciding not to care about everybody else. He's not giving up on the rest of the world. He actually thinks the best way to bless everybody is to pick one guy and reveal himself in a special way to that family and to help them to understand what does it look like to live well with God and with each other. And then the blessing will be so great that it will start to flow out to other people as well. So the blessing of Abram, and therefore the blessing of the Israelites, is not forgetting about everybody else.
Yeah.
It's for the sake of everyone else.
Yeah, I love that's such an important point, and it's one of the places I start when I'm teaching people about politics is actually to say the beginning of the story of the people of God is a story of orientation outward to the world, of being a blessing to the nations.
Yes.
So at this point in the story, we don't know a ton about Abram yet, but I can imagine a kid saying, oh, well, if I was God and I was going to pick someone to be a blessing to the nations, I would pick the best person to do that. And maybe God lined up all of the people and thought, okay, here's the best one. So why did God choose Abram on that level? Like, was there something about Abram? Was there something about his family that God was like, these are the best people?
You know, as we follow the story of Abram, we find that they make a lot of mistakes. Abram actually doesn't trust God very well. He keeps trying to do things on his own. His wife doesn't trust God very well and has some bad ideas. We're told that they mistreat their slaves. So there's layers of problems there.
Yeah.
And so I don't think we're supposed to see Abram as somehow the winner of the Student of the Month award or something. It's not like he got to go to the head of the class.
Yeah.
God chose him for reasons that we can't explain. He's just an ordinary guy, and he does follow God to this new land. And then we watch him as he kind of tries to figure out what does it look like to walk with God. And he makes lots of mistakes. And later, his descendants seem to be in danger of misunderstanding their special status. And so I love the way God addresses them in the book of Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy is fast forwarding past the Exodus, past their time at Mount Sinai, getting the laws, and they're getting ready to go into the promised land. And several times God speaks through Moses to the people just to clarify, like, don't think this is happening to you because you're better than other people. So one of those is in Deuteronomy chapter 7, where he says in verse 7, the Lord did not set his affection on you and choose you because you were more numerous than other peoples, for you were the fewest. It was because the Lord loved you and kept the oath he swore to your ancestors that he brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the land of slavery, from the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So it's saying that God didn't choose them because, wow, this is a really big and powerful group of people. I think that it'll work if I pick them. They were actually few in number, and they were being oppressed by the Egyptian rulers. And it says God wanted to keep the promise that he made to Abraham. That's why they end up getting rescued from Egypt, not because they're bigger and better. And then chapter 9 gets even more specific. Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 4. It's talking about when they enter into the land and they drive out the people who already live there.
We could say a lot more about this driving the people out of the land business, and we will at a later episode. But For now, you can go back one episode to hear Dr. Lynch talk about different approaches to violence in the Bible.
It says, after the Lord your God has driven them out before you, do not say to yourself, the Lord has brought me here to take possession of this land because of my righteousness. No, it's on account of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is going to drive them out before you. It's not because of your righteousness or your integrity that you're going to take possession of their land, but on account of the wickedness of these nations. So God is looking at the nations in the land and he's like, your time's up. You had your chance. You are behaving terribly and you can't live in this place anymore. And so he moves them out and makes room for the Israelites, not because the Israelites are better, but because the clock has run out on the people that have been living there. And God wants to do kind of an experiment with the family of Abraham and say, what if we could be, to use a phrase that I know you love, a city on a hill?
Yeah. Dr. Imes is referencing a phrase from the New Testament here, a city on a hill, that Jesus uses to describe the people of God in the Sermon on the Mount. But he's drawing on Old Testament language that already described the people of God in Israel in similar ways, as a community that testifies to God's goodness by their life together.
What if we could be a nation that actually lives well with God and then mediates that blessing to others?
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about that. Even from the first passage that you read, you will be a blessing to the nations. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about practically what that means, or what it should have meant, or maybe some of the failures tell us what it should have meant too. But I'm imagining someone saying it still feels sort of unfair to choose a certain people. And it kind of almost seems like consolation prize to say, oh, you'll be a blessing to the nations. But how does that work itself out throughout the story?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a couple of ways that it does. At first, Israel is more of a come and see kind of a project. Like God is going to work in them. And the idea with the laws at Mount Sinai that he gives them after he sets them free from slavery is, if you live in this way, then your society is going to be the kind of place where every single member of the community can flourish. That people aren't taking what doesn't belong to them. People aren't trying to hurt their neighbors. They're loving their neighbors. And so everyone can find a place and find a way to contribute and find a way to belong. Even foreigners can belong. And so there's a path for foreigners to join. And we have a couple of glimpses of this in the Old Testament story, where somebody who's not an Israelite receives blessing because of their association, their positive association with the Israelites. So the first one that comes to mind is Jethro, who's Moses' father-in-law from Midian. And he comes to Moses in chapter 18 of Exodus, and he's just celebrating all of the wonderful things that God has done on their behalf to set them free from slavery. And it just sort of gets to revel in that blessing, and they eat this covenant meal together. And then he gives some good advice to Moses about how to run this new country, and Moses takes the advice. So there's this positive, collaborative relationship with Jethro, and he doesn't become an Israelite, he just visits. But because he's positively allied with the Israelites, there's a blessing for him in it. And then the next one that comes to mind is Rahab, who is the first Canaanite we meet when they go into the land. And they've been prepared that the Canaanites need to be driven out. But the first one they meet actually invites them in to her home, declares allegiance to Yahweh, and she's saved. And so when the rest of her community is killed in battle, she and her household are saved, and then they're incorporated into the people of Israel. They get to join the Israelites. And so they're blessed through the Israelites because of what God said to Abram, whoever blesses you, I will bless. And she is an example of a Canaanite who blesses them rather than trying to get rid of them. So we have a few glimpses like that. Through the Old Testament, of people recognizing that Yahweh is the most powerful God, that if they ally themselves to him and his people and treat them well, then there will be benefits, tangible benefits for that. I'm thinking of Naaman, the Syrian general who has a skin disease, and he has a slave captured from a raid in Israel, this little girl who says, oh, back where I come from, there's a prophet and he can heal you. And so the Syrian general goes and finds the prophet and is healed. That's another example of the nations being blessed by a positive association with the people of Israel. And then if we fast forward all the way to the New Testament, we see that all of a sudden people who are not Jewish, who are not part of the nation of Israel, start to follow Jesus, and they want to become part of what God is doing, and they're fully incorporated. So I'm guessing that the kid who called in this great question is probably not Jewish, probably doesn't have Jewish background. And if they're in a family that's following Jesus, which it sounds like they are, then they are the direct recipients of the blessing through the Jewish people, the family of Abraham, that goes to all nations. If we're not Jewish and we're part of the faith community, then we have been blessed by the people from whom Jesus came.
And now a word from our sponsor. Wait, what's a sponsor?
How often do you buy skincare products because they're labeled as clean and organic and paraben-free, but you can't be sure what any of those words mean or if the products are truly USDA certified organic? Well, the search is over. Purity Woods' mission is to provide people with the cleanest and most effective healthy aging and longevity products available. Purity Woods' products leverage the wonders of a revolutionary ingredient, maple leaf extract. Maple leaves contain anti-inflammatory, antioxidants, and hydrating properties, which can help soothe irritated or inflamed skin while also plumping, brightening, and nourishing it. It was formulated by skincare chemists at the top of their field to create a product that supports collagen and elastin production without irritation. We have a special offer for you to try out Purity Woods' age-defying Dream Cream. Purity Woods is currently offering 17% off site-wide, but we have an additional 10% discount for our listeners for a total savings of 27%. Go to puritywoods.com/curiously or enter code CURIOUSLY at checkout for an additional 10% off your first order. That's puritywoods.com and enter code CURIOUSLY for a total of 27% off your first order. There's this all of these examples of this being a blessing to the nations throughout the Old Testament. And then there's also Jesus who comes to us through the people of God in Israel. Let's talk a little bit too about, because on one hand, we could think of the story of Israel and say oh, this is sort of unfair that this one people is chosen by God. On the other hand, we could look at the Old Testament and go, they have a lot more rules to follow than the other nations. And we might be I'm kind of glad I'm not one of those ones that's chosen. Can you talk a little bit about what is part of this chosenness for Israel? What does that practically look like internally for them?
Yeah, I feel like I heard an echo of my favorite Old Testament Bible verse in the kids' question that I'm glad to circle back to. So I'm thinking about Exodus 19, verses 4-6, which is the first thing that God says to the Israelites when they arrive at Mount Sinai. Mm-hmm. And it sets up the whole purpose for why does he give them a bunch of laws, which you're right. We tend to think negatively of laws oh, that seems like a ball and chain, but that's not how they thought about them. And that's not how Moses thought about them. But back to Exodus 19, he says, "This is what you're to say to the descendants of Jacob and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations, you will be my treasured possession." It's that out of all nations part that I felt like I heard in the question. Why did God choose the Israelites as a special people out of everyone else? Yeah. And God is specifically saying, out of all the nations, that they all belong to me, but you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So I think it's really helpful for us to drill down and see if we can understand better what those titles mean. When God calls them his treasured possession, he's not just trying to think up something really nice to say. like when parents pick a little pet name for their kids, like Buddy or Peachy or whatever name, Sweetheart. Yeah. This isn't just sweetheart. Yeah. This is actually an official title that would have been given in a context where there was a treaty or covenant.
Remember when we talked about covenant last week? Here, Dr. Imes is moving from covenant as a general idea to one specific form of a covenant that existed at the time Israel would have heard this from God. In this form, the relationship between the two parties is not equal, like it would be in a marriage covenant, but unequal between a more powerful party and a less powerful party.
And the one who is the treasured possession, or the Hebrew word is segala, is like a special representative of the more powerful person. So I was trying to think of an analogy for this that would work with kids. And I was thinking about a classroom. I don't know if this ever happens, but if the teacher, so imagine a classroom full of kids. If the teacher has to step out into the hall for a moment, or go use the bathroom or something, and there's not another adult that can come and be put in charge, maybe what the teacher will do is select a student in the class that she or he can trust, and say, okay, I'm going to step out for a minute. You're in charge while I'm away, and keep the peace. Now, for a teacher to do that, they have to really trust that this student is not going to say, jailbreak, let's all get out of here. Like it's time for recess. But that they will take seriously the task of maintaining order. And that's kind of what it means to be God's treasured possession. He is appointing the Israelites to help rule on his behalf, because not everyone can see Yahweh and hear his commands. The Israelites understand his commands, and they're supposed to kind of mediate that sense of order and doing the right thing to those around them. So it's a special role. It's a special job. It's not just like getting picked to win an award. It's more like getting tagged in a game of tag. If you're playing tag and someone tags you, then you're it. And when you're it, you don't just sit back and cross your arms and say, wow, I must be really special. I'm it. No, you go chase people. Like that's what it means to be it. You run around and try to tag other people. And if you're playing blob tag, there's many names for this. Zombie tag or blob tag or whatever. Then the goal, then everyone who's tagged is also it. And there's more and more people who've been tagged, and they're all part of tagging everybody else. That's how I actually think about God's idea of election, or of choosing the Israelites. That he's tagging the Israelites and saying, you're it. But that doesn't mean nobody else matters. It means their job is now to go and tag as many people as possible. They're blessing all nations until everybody's it.
Yeah, that's so helpful. And I feel like even in families, sometimes this happens where it's like, one of you is the one that I'm trusting to just kind of make sure everything's okay for a minute, or the first one who can babysit, and sometimes it's not the oldest. Sometimes it's like, there's a different one that I think might keep this from getting out of control.
Oh dear.
Dr. Imes, this is a big question, so you don't have to give a thorough answer to it. And we might even do episodes in the future that dive into this. But I could also imagine a kid or an adult who's listening to the kid question, thinking like, yeah, God chose Israel in the Old Testament, and then in the New Testament, we're kind of done with Israel. So what does this kind of chosenness, does this continue? And you've already sort of said to us, there's a sense in which we benefit from this chosenness, even though we are not Jewish, Christians who are grafted in.
Yeah, we've been tagged.
But how do we think about this chosenness in terms of the way the story continues to unfold?
Oh, that's such a good question. What I see happening in the New Testament is not that Israel is being set aside and they don't matter anymore, and that the law at Sinai doesn't matter anymore, but that they become the focal point or the center of what God is doing to bless all nations through Jesus. Yeah. So maybe not everybody out there listening has really processed the idea that Jesus was Jewish. Yeah. Because they think of Jesus as like, if you're a Christian and you believe in Jesus, then you think of Jesus as being the first Christian. Yeah. But Jesus was Jewish, and he came to save the Jewish people. He came to reconcile them back to God, because as history shows, not all of the people of Israel were living well with God and with each other. And they made a lot of mistakes, and they lost their place in the land and had to go into exile. And so God sends Jesus to help reconcile all of Israel back to him. And because Jesus is Jewish, God's not done with Jewish people. Like now, the way I see it is...
Did you catch what Dr. Imes just said? The way I see it is. She's saying that for two reasons. One, she's a humble scholar who wants to make clear that she's giving you one interpretation of what's happening in the Bible, among other possible interpretations. But two, this question of the relationship between Israel and the church is a complicated one that the church has often gotten wrong in the past, to the point of anti-Jewish violence, and that scholars continue to argue and puzzle over today.
Our only way of experiencing God's blessing is through our relationship with Jesus, the Jewish Messiah.
Yeah.
So rather than replacing Israel, the church, I think, gets incorporated with Israel.
Yeah. Dr. Imes, imagine that you are actually with this small child who asked this question and said, why did God choose Israel and bless them instead of other nations? What would your short kid answer to them be?
Yes. I would say that is such a great question that many people wonder about. God did not choose the Israelites because they were better than other people or stronger than other people or even more obedient than other people. God chose the Israelites because he wanted one family who he could show himself to more fully, and they could come to know him and come to know what he expects of people, and they could live in that way and show the whole world what he's like. And so God's plan to bless Israel is his plan to bless all nations through Israel. So by choosing the Israelites, he's not forgetting about everybody else, but he's wanting to bless everyone else using the Israelites as his partners.
That's so helpful. Thank you. And thank you so much, Dr. Imes, for taking this question really seriously with me.
Absolutely.
I hope you caught an important word Dr. Imes used in this conversation: mediate. God chose to use Israel to mediate blessing from God to all of creation. God uses mediators all throughout Scripture, graciously allowing humans to participate in what he is doing in his creation. I think we have sometimes gotten this role a little confused. Sometimes Christians have thought of ourselves as the people who have all the right ideas, with access to perfectly accurate information that no one else has, who have a special connection with God so we know what God thinks about everything here on earth. And that's not totally wrong. Part of Israel's chosenness is a special relationship with God, so they could know how God wants people to live and tell the nations about it. And that's not totally different for Christians either, as people grafted into the people of God. But sometimes Christians have isolated this part of being God's people away from the rest of the story. We've ignored the part where the people of God are to be a blessing to the nations, not just in what we know and proclaim, but in how we live, how we treat people, how we serve our communities. Next time you're reading the Bible, think about this question: how are the people in this part of the story either bringing God's blessing to the world or failing to do that? How can we bless the communities we live in? How have we failed in the past to bring blessing? But let's not forget the best news of the story, as Dr. Imes described, that God is faithful to bring blessing even when God's people fail. And even though we do fail, God keeps asking us, inviting us again and again to participate in blessing creation. Curiously Kaitlyn is a production of Holy Post Media. Produced by Mike Stralo. Editing by Seth Gorvet. Theme song by Phil Vischer. Be sure to follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and leave a review so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus cute kids, and never any butt news.